Hello and welcome to a new episode of Markets and Morality, our IA show where we discuss contradicting opinions within the classical liberal free market tent. I will be your host, Bartha, the head of international outreach here at the IA. This week's topic is very much a personal favorite of mine because it links theory and practice. I think it's very easy to be a pure libertarian as an academic, but if we want our ideas to be realized, we do need to influence people outside of our own bubbles as well. And in order to do that, we often need allies from across the political spectrum, at least for as long as libertarians aren't 51% of the electorate. So today's discussion will be about what kind of alliances classical liberals should pursue. And in order to do that, I'm delighted to welcome Aaron Powell to the show. Aaron is the host of Reimagining Liberty, a show about the cosmopolitan, forward-looking case for radical liberty. Aaron was formerly the director and editor of libertarianism.org, a project of the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. It's also great to have Lorenzo Montanari with us, who's the vice president of international affairs at the D.C.-based think tank Americans for Tax Reform, and the executive director of the Property Rights Alliance. Lorenzo, Aaron, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation, Adam.
Aaron, I would like to start with the theoretical concept behind political alliances and get some definitions out of the way. So, unlike Americans, we Europeans use liberal in the proper sense, meaning classical liberal, pro-market, if you like, libertarian-leaning bunch. So having this sort of group in mind, what do you think, or why do you think that most classical liberal-leaning politicians found themselves in the conservative group like the Republican Party rather than left-leaning groups like the Democratic Party? Were free markets more important to these individuals than freedom in the social domain?
It's not an easy question because a lot of it depends upon kind of historical accidents unique to the American experience. But broadly speaking, there are, I think, two phases where liberals in the European or the libertarian sense were drawn to ally at least with Republicans and conservatives. The first of those was in the New Deal, was opposition to the New Deal and the massive government intervention into the economy and just our everyday lives that represented. So you picked, it wasn't necessarily that liberals agreed with Republicans, it was just they could find common cause against the rise of New Dealism. And the other one was then later in the 20th century, the threat of communism in the Soviet Union and making common cause against that enemy. And the combination of those two things meant that those with a free market approach, those with a classical liberal approach, had spent enough time within Republican and conservative circles that they started just building out greater alliances with them. And then the real partisan nature of American politics, that we're forced into this two-party system, it's very hard for independents to gain any traction, meant that there was a desire to basically make an alliance. We're going to pick a side, and we're going to try to encourage, cultivate our ideas within that side against the other side. And whether this was wise during the New Deal or during the scares about communism, I think it has become considerably less wise now, given the shifting political landscape.
I know that you're pretty skeptical about the libertarian conservative fusionism, and we will talk a lot about the future as well. But sticking to the present for a moment and maybe the near past, Lorenzo, I know that your work at ATR is very much focused on economic reforms, especially tax reforms, rather than social issues. But my question to you is whether we think that conservatives are still better at realizing free market reforms than others. Is it true that in the new era of conservatism that's more dominated by Trump's, Boris Johnson's, or Orban's rather than Reagan's and Thatcher's, conservatives still stand for pro-market reforms?
Well, let me say that this is a very key question, considering that the current situation inside the modern conservative movement. mean, the modern conservative movement, let's say, use this label, has never been a monolithic political bloc, but always a network of different groups, such as paleoconservative, neoconservative, classic liberal, traditional, social conservative, and so on. Until also recently, we are approaching, there is a new political conservative line of thought, the so-called national conservatives, led by Dr. Yoram Azoni. Is a new conservative political group that mainly is in contrast to fusionism, that has been led by the American intellectual Frank Meyer or William Buckley in the 60s, that was able to anticipate and make elected Ronald Reagan. However, I still believe that fusionism can play an important role. I still believe that the classic liberal and libertarian conservative, with all the differences inside, should still work together. I know that there is this new wave of conservatives that try to split the free market idea from the conservative idea. In one way, Trump represents this approach, Orban's this approach. But I mean, let's stick to the fact. I mean, even if in one way Trump has implemented the very bad trade barrier policy, or is pushing for a no Republican anti-immigration rhetoric, in one way the 2017 Trump tax reform has been one of the most important economic reform implemented in the USA since Ronald Reagan. Tax reform. So I still want to believe that conservatives can still play an important role in implementing free market reform, at least from the taxation side. Even if there are some tendency that in some conservative approach, they are criticizing or they are not implementing a strong rule of law, for example. But I still want to believe that, I mean, I consider myself someone that follow and support the fusionistic approach, and I still believe that there is still room for this political approach and bringing together free market, libertarian, conservative.
Aaron, what's your attitude when it comes to taxation? Is the issue important enough for classical liberals to accept a lot of the anti-liberal positions of the Republican Party? Or we basically have to measure up, and you might conclude that, okay, economic reforms are not significant enough in order to justify fusionism in the future?
Taxation is important, but it's not the whole of liberty. And there are a lot of liberties that are as important as how much money the government's taking out of your paycheck. And I think that there's a tendency to overlook a lot of real impositions on liberty if people are willing to drop taxes. And I'm also concerned that it seems like even on the tax reform, Republicans seem increasingly willing to use taxation and threats of tax breaks or removing them as a way to punish corporations that are behaving in ways that run counter to social conservative preferences and tastes. And so even there, it feels like, yes, lowering taxes is important, but if what comes with it is a radical scaling back of gay rights, a virulently nationalist and anti-immigration agenda, a punishing of corporations for exercising freedom of association and freedom of speech, a ramping up of a drug war, and an empowering of police misconduct and so on, like those are an extraordinary number of costs. And my worry is that we may be willing to just overlook them if we think we can get some lower taxes. And lower taxes are good, but there's a point at which the other stuff outweighs it.
And you think we arrive to the point where the negative outweighs the positive when it comes to conservatism? And
I think with a Republican Party that seems legitimately committed to overthrowing the peaceful transfer of power in this country, which would, had they succeeded on January 6th, that would have been the end of American democracy. Like that's a pretty substantial cost, and it's one that doesn't appear to be fringe to, you know, a handful of weird people at the edges of the party. It seems to be the party's stated goal at this point. And so that's a pretty big cost.
Lorenzo, you mentioned the importance of economic reforms, though, and it seems like, especially on tax reform, it was the Republicans who pushed the agenda that we liked rather than the Democrats. But if you know my colleague, Dr. Steve Davies, who's a historian at the Institute of Economic Affairs, he has the theory of political realignment. And his theory basically outlines that the future of political conflict will be about open versus closed societies rather than about economic questions, so rather than economic redistribution in general. So first of all, do you believe that he's right? Do you believe that the political realignment theory is correct? And if so, what are then the implications of this political realignment on our alliances in the future? Are you worried that the conservatives are going to be pushed into the corner of closed societies that might occasionally advocate for the tax reforms that we like, but as Aaron mentioned, on all the other issues, basically the negatives will outweigh the positives?
Well, there is always a risk that it could be conservative. Any politician can end up in a bad group. It's the same reason that we ask everyone running for office to sign a pledge, a taxpayer pledge, that they swear they will never vote for any law that implies tax increase, because we don't trust they promises by voices. So I cannot say that. I agree with you. Considering what is happening in Ukraine, I would prefer to think that the war is dividing itself more and more between liberal democracy, so more open society, versus autocracy on the other side. And in my opinion, the current war in Ukraine implies a new definition of a geoeconomics and geopolitical relationship. So for example, I personally disagree of the current narrative that globalization is over, but that we are entering in a deglobalization era. On the contrary, because of the war is more and more divided between the liberal democracy bloc and autocracy bloc on the other side, I think there will be a decoupling within the globalization. So what I want to say is that we may have a possible scenario with where there will be a new globalization among liberal democracy based on free market, accountability, transparency, common value, rule of law, versus the globalism of autocracy based on chronic capitalism, lack of individual freedom, lack of transparency, and limited rule of law, if not limit property rights. So the question is how the supply chain will be reshaped between the globalization, the new globalization, and globalism, between liberal democracy and autocracy. I mean, the new globalization, I would say, led hopefully by liberal democracy, it will be based mainly on digital exchange, technology, innovation, the globalization of ideas, knowledge. So even in this case, I see that, for example, there is a big open question to how fusionism, from my point of view, will able to reinvent itself within this new scenario, global scenario.
And you think that the conservative voices will be part of that kind of liberal democratic institutional structure and will endorse, if you like, NATO for economic free trade? Or you think that some of these conservative voices who are already criticizing the Biden administrations for getting too involved with the Ukrainian situation may side with the anti-globalist, anti-liberal side?
But I hope that the conservative always stand with rule of law, democracy, open society, that is not in contrast, from my point of view, to the liberal democracy, because I consider traditional conservative, Reagan conservative, so I mix between free market, and I completely disagree on implementation of any type of trade barriers. One of the reasons we create in 2019 the trade barrier index is because we really want to contrast the Trump trade barrier policy and demonstrate that protectionism never works. Same for the immigration. I agree with Aaron that, I mean, we really need to contrast any type of anti-immigration. One from one side is illegal immigration, but even Trump was moving forward to limit the legal immigration, limit the green card or the H-1B visa, you know. So this is something that is not the traditional, from my point of view, conservative approach to immigration. If we believe in a free market, we need to believe in immigration. I mean, we cannot implement any type of anti-immigration law only because it's stealing work from, you know. So this is something that we definitely need. There is a risk of this type of leaning policy in some branch of the conservative. But it's more traditional. I mean, we know that the anti-immigration bloc in the United States are more pushing by the trade union traditionally. So, so I really hope no. I still want to believe that the Anglo-Saxon conservative approach should still lead, you know, the center-right coalitions, not only in the US but also in Europe, all over the world. This is my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Aaron, coming back to you for a second, it's very clear that you dislike this conservative libertarian fusionism because you think that the negatives outweigh the positives. But if the conservatives are not the right allies for us classical liberals, and if we accept that classical liberals won't be the majority of the population, neither in the United States nor here in Europe, if they won't be the majority, the 51% of the electorate, then who should be our new political allies? Can we reach out to left-wing political parties and find common ground with them? Green parties? Who should be that we're searching for?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it gets to, you started off by saying, let's define some terms. And I think it is important to be clear that what fusionism in this sense means is not libertarians and classical liberals will work with conservatives. Because of course, they should, like, if there are conservatives who we think we can work with to advance the cause of liberty, we should work with them, just as if there are progressives on issues we think we can work with to advance the cause of liberty, we should work with them. What fusionism is the belief that libertarians and classical liberals should pick a side and embed ourselves within it. We should, so in the US, we should see ourselves as part of the Republican Party, as a block within it, as opposed to being independent, and we should view ourselves as being of the right as opposed to being genuinely independent, which is of course a new thing. Like, we're liberals. We, like, libertarianism originated on the left. It was never a movement of the right. It was a movement of the left against the right historically. But what that means going forward is, I think the most effective way for libertarians to approach policy change is to view themselves more as a special interest for liberty, as opposed to being members of one political party or another. So no, we should not have a counter-fusionism with the Democrats or the left, but instead we should say, just as there are lots of organizations, Americans for Tax Reform is one of them, that has a particular issue that it is working on, or drug policy, marijuana legalization is our organization's issue. Libertarians should view themselves as our issue is advancing liberty, and we will work with whoever we think on a given sub-issue of that we can advance that. So that might be conservatives on taxes, but it might be then progressives on surveillance reform or police reform. There are a lot of these issues, and so it's more picking on an individual issue basis versus saying we are members of this tribe against this other tribe.
And what do you think should be the kind of founding pillar, or if you like, multiple founding pillars of this new approach? So at the moment, in the last couple of decades, I think it was very much free markets, right? There was we are the United States run by capitalist systems, and we are in strong opposition to the Soviet Union, which has a communist socialist system. What do you think that the new founding pillars of the libertarian movement should be?
So I think markets remain a huge part of it, because markets simply are freedom of a deeply personal nature. They're also great engine of wealth creation, but even if we found other engines of wealth creation, we shouldn't replace the freedom of markets necessarily with them, because these are freedoms that matter to people. But at the same time, we should care about social freedoms deeply. And one of the worrying things is that I think a lot of conservatives supported markets when market outcomes were producing wealth, but weren't really undermining conservative values and preferences and hierarchies. And what we've seen over the last several years, what's going on in Florida with Disney and so on, is an example of markets started generating outcomes that didn't align with conservative preferences. And a lot of conservatives, including a lot of leaders, said, okay, now I'm going to throw away my commitment to markets because my real underlying commitment was to these traditions and conservative values and so on. So I think it is centering what I would call like the genuinely liberal values of freedom and autonomy and radical self-authorship and people's ability to construct their own narratives of their lives and live them free from interference as long as they're not harming others. And that's going to include markets, but it's going to include a lot of things. And so as the conservatives drift further from those other things, we should be looking for opportunities to work with people who are committed as broadly as possible to those ideas.
Lorenzo, are you optimistic? Do you think that some of these founding pillars are going to be reasonably popular within conservative circles?
In one way, yes. I mean, I still believe, let's rephrase the word fusionism. I like to call more leave us alone coalition. So it's an even broader framework where we need to work together to contrast neo-Keynesian policy, statalism, neo-socialism. This is the reason I still believe that we are facing the same, let's call, enemy. Fusionism was perfect to contrast communists. We are aware about that. It was a perfect combination, and now the time changed. We have different type of enemy, like, for example, was mentioned before, globalism. So I still believe that if we are able to reshape a new type of fusionism, including all the differences that Aaron was pointing out, and some of them I agree. I mean, for example, anti-immigration policy shouldn't belong to the traditional center-right coalition, but I think there is still room to work together on that. I mean, neo-Keynesian policy are not being defeated; they are still leading the world. The globalism that is basically the bad ideology behind the degeneration of globalization. So we still need to avoid. Working together needs to be also to fight protectionism. That is something that I see there is an increasing interest also in some small branch of the conservative, but because maybe they are losing some free market idea. And I think it's very clear. I still believe that there is a lot to do together. There are some differences, of course, but it will be impossible to build up a monolithic political bloc where everyone agree. I bring leave us alone coalition it could be single issues groups, everyone's fighting for their freedom. But the point is, let's keep improving, let's keep expanding freedom in our society. And let's try to remind that we need to keep a limit government approach. This is, for me, is conservatism and being fiscal conservatism. Let's put it this way. And after there could be issues, differences on social issues like abortion or legalization of drugs. It's fine, but we need to keep expanding freedom, and this is something that can happen together.
Is the approach also workable here in Europe? I know that both of you are DC based, but Lorenzo, you're very active in European countries yourself. You have mentioned the tax reform as one of the main conservative success stories in the United States. But do we have European examples where the conservatives are equally pro-market, at least in some regards? I mean, here in the United Kingdom, we have had a supposedly conservative government for quite a long time. My taxes are constantly increasing, welfare handouts are constantly increasing, free trade is not doing very well, although there are some positive voices on that front. So it's not a very free market or even pro-market approach that the Conservatives have implemented here in the UK. Do you think it's different in other European countries? Do we have positive examples of liberalizing reforms there?
No, this type of risk of increasing protectionist policy, even inside the center-right or conservative government, is something we are experiencing in the US, also even under Trump, but also in some center-right government in Europe. This is a lack of political culture, in my point of view. And it's time maybe that a lot of politicians, they should go back and read books and refresh some idea. This is my.
So we are doing a bad job as think tankers. We're not equipping them with the right ideas.
Well, we always, maybe we also is also our fault, I don't know, but we need to communicate better our idea. But Europe is a big and open challenge on that, because you also based there. And I'm often in Brussels like you. I mean, it's still difficult to use term like a free market, even inside or among center-right politicians,
right.
So it's difficult because, and it happens several times. I'm using free market. They look at me like an alien, So, and I'm supposed to speak with someone who is a center-right. So again, there is a big lack of political culture. People, they think they're center-right. Sometimes they're acting more as a neo-Keynesian. And the risk I see that I really don't like the narrative that the conservatives, they should detach from liberalism or from a free market idea. Because you will have a consequence like having, for a conservative leader, increasing taxation or expanding public spending. So this is the consequence. So this is the reason that we need to stay together for this reason. Otherwise, should we keep calling center-right a coalition that is increasing taxes?
Right.
Or affecting accountability, transparency, rule of law? This is not a question, and that this is something that, as a think tank, we need to work on that. Also, on the individual basis, it is impossible to educate. Let's put into the bracket this will educate the entire political party, but if we work with individual politicians, and there are a lot of individual politicians inside coalition that maybe they don't have a clear idea what does it mean being free market. I think there's still room for improvement, but this is our job, and this is what we try to do.
So that's very similar to the system that they're in.
I conclude. Sorry, I want to take much of time, but what we do most of the time also, we as you know, we like to build coalitions among the different branch of the conservative free market movement. We like to propose sometimes also when it's possible, the taxpayer pledge. So simple policy tool that, if implemented, create a block inside even a political party. There are examples like in Greece that Alexander Skoras, the leader of the free market think tank AFIM, has been pushing and promoting the taxpayer pledge in Greece. Sure. This is a step forward to change the mentality among the center-right politicians. There is a lot to do, not only to contrast the center-left, but also make sure the center-right politicians, they learn and they implement right reform,
Sure. So this case-by-case basis is reasonably similar to what Aaron has also described. But I'm wondering, Aaron, whether there is kind of an example where your theory was put into practice, where it's a case-by-case coalition, not with the conservatives, but with maybe left-leaning groups where classical liberals or libertarians have been successful in pushing for liberalizing reforms. Do you have any examples from the United States or anywhere in the globe where this other type of coalition building with non-conservative forces have worked out well?
Sure. I think the big one in the US has been the ongoing rolling back of the drug war. The legalization of drugs, which is a tremendous boon for individual liberty, both in terms of individuals being able to put in their body what they want to put in their body, but also just the tremendous damage that fighting the drug war does to the country, to civil liberties, to minority rights, and so on. And that has largely come about through working often at the state level, because there has been less traction at the federal level, with left-leaning groups against more conservative intransigence against legalizing drugs. So I would point to that as, I think, the biggest and most impactful and still ongoing one, in recent memory.
Yeah, I mean, the drug war has an impact on everything. So that's, hopefully it's going to be happening in more countries across the globe, not just the United States. I'm aware that we are pretty short on time, so just one final question to both of you. Aaron, first to you, I would be very curious to hear your prediction for the future. So in 10 years' time, if we're looking back at our conversation today, what do you expect? Are we going to live in a economically and socially freer Western liberal democracy, or is the situation going to get worse in the next 10 years?
That's an awfully hard question. I want to be optimistic. I think a lot of it is what 10 years from now looks like is going to depend a lot on what 2 or 3 years from now looks like. If we see in the next wave of elections populists defeated, then I think liberalism and liberal institutions can reassert themselves. But if in the 2024 American election or in upcoming elections elsewhere, if the populist and anti-democratic forces win those, then I think things could go very poorly 10 years from now. And it's way too close to call at the moment. I guess I want to be optimistic, but I also really worry about what's going to happen in elections in the next few years.
Lorenzo, what's your attitude? Are you a bit more optimistic than Aaron?
Well, I'm always optimistic, even if there is not a great sign to be optimistic. But I agree. We need to see also what type of staying, for example, on the US midterm election. We need to see what type of candidate, what type of politician will be elected. This is a big challenge. We need more free market, less protectionist politician from both sides. But I see that there is also a risk of a protectionism raising inside the so-called conservative movement in the US. We need to, the question for us as a free market conservative is how should we face the new challenge of liberal democracy? How should we face the new globalization, as I described before? Because rule of law, transparency, sharing a common value, that doesn't necessarily mean the Western civilization, but it will be part. But I hope Asian country, they embrace more and more, or African rule of law, transparency. This is the common value that if we believe in freedom, we should embrace. So these are reasons that I want to be optimistic, because traveling around the world as you do, be in touch with a lot of activists that are fighting for freedom, I see there is always a need to a big claim for freedom. This kept me optimistic on that. I don't see that there is a need. I don't see among the people a need of autocracy, but there is always need to more freedom in their life. But this is up to us also. We cannot blame only politicians. We need to work maybe harder as a think tank and to try to communicate maybe in a better way. What does it mean fighting for freedom? What does it mean freedom of speech? That something we see that the freedom of speech has been affected most of the time through different hidden policy. It could be the tax harmonization. It could be the global minimum tax that leaning left government tried to implement at the global stage. It could be affecting the suspension of a patent on COVID vaccine. This is the real battle step by step we need to fight every day, or over-regulation on digital economy. that basically is a kind of a trade war between, in this case, European Union and American digital company like a DMA, DSA regulation. So if we
a lot to resolve,
a lot to resolve, but I want to be optimistic because freedom will always prevail.
On this optimistic note, Lorenzo, Aaron, thank you so much for the discussion. And thank you to our dear audience as well for joining. If you are interested in continuing the debate, then please do so in the comment section below this video or by following IE London on Twitter. Also, special thanks to our donors, without whom our work at the IE would not be possible. If you wish to contribute yourself and support our work, consider subscribing to our Patreon account, where you can have a sneak peek and have exclusive contents behind our Patreon subscribers wall. But for now, thank you very much for joining, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time again.